Now on links to devices that don't support DTP, the port will remain an access port. So on this link between switch 2 and router 2, the default mode is being used, which is dynamic auto. So DTP is enabled, but it's using dynamic auto. I'll configure it to use desirable. Show interface gigabit 0 to switch port. Notice the administrative mode is dynamic desirable, but the operational mode is static access. So it's not trunking, it's remained as an access port in the default VLAN of 1. And that's because router 2 isn't configured to use DTP. This interface is a routed interface. It's not a switch port interface. At the moment, that interface is down, so let's enable it and see if it makes any difference. But notice if we type the command show switch port, it's not going to work. Show interface F0/0. This is a routed port, not a switch port interface. So it's acting as a PC or traditional router. On switch 2, show interface gigabit 02 switch port, notice the mode has remained as static access, even though it's configured as desirable. That will be true for both dynamic auto and dynamic desirable. Unless both sides can negotiate to use DTP, it will just remain an access port in the default VLAN, which is VLAN 1. Now let's look at some negotiation. So let's do some Wireshark captures. So I'm going to start capturing traffic on the hub, in this case on port 2. The switches are using gigabit 03. So show interface gigabit 03 switch port. At the moment it's configured to use dynamic auto, in other words DTP but auto mode. The same is true on switch 2, notice dynamic auto. In the Wireshark capture we see spanning tree BPDUs, we see some CDP messages, and notice here we see dynamic trunk protocol. We can see a message from switch with MAC address ending in CC03 configured for auto access mode. Show interface gigabit 03. Notice this is the MAC address of switch 2 ending in CC03. So in the output we can see the trunk status. Value is configured for auto access. It's using ISL. And the sender ID is switch 2. We can also see a message from switch 1. Notice MAC address FF03. Show interface gigabit 03. So there's the command. Notice the MAC address ends in FF03. This switch is also using DTP auto access mode. Scrolling down, we can see it wants to negotiate to use ISL. And there's the MAC address of the switch. So at the moment, neither side is initiating trunking. So if we type show interface trunk, you'll notice gigabit 03 is not in the list of trunk ports. On either side, show interface gigabit 03 switch port. At the moment, it's operating as an access port. We can see that on both sides. But if we change one side, so interface gigabit 03, switch port, mode, dynamic, desirable, show interface trunk. Notice that gigabit 03 is configured to use trunking with ISL encapsulation because this side is configured as desirable. Show interface trunk. This side is configured as auto, so they've negotiated to set up a trunk. In the Wireshark capture, I'll scroll down. Here we have a message from switch 2. Notice the mode is trunk desirable. So the switch is initiating the trunking using ISL with switch 1. Switch 1 is still using trunk auto, but switch 2 is using dynamic desirable trunking. So it's initiating the trunking. What happens if we change the encapsulation? So interface gigabit 03, switch port, trunk encapsulation .1Q. Show interface trunk on the left hand side. Notice the trunking is changed to .1Q. Previously it had negotiated to use ISL. In the Wireshark capture, scrolling up, we should see some messages. Here's switch 2, trunk desirable, wanting to use 802.1Q rather than ISL. So notice the trunk operating type is 802.1Q. Switch 2 is negotiating with switch 1, which is still using dynamic auto to set up a trunk. And that's what's happened. Switch 1 is using auto mode, but is currently using trunking, using 802.1Q with switch 2, because switch 2 is configured with desirable mode and is initiating the trunk. So there are some examples of using dynamic trunking protocol to dynamically configure a trunk between two switches. The recommendation, once again, is don't use DTP. So turn off DTP and manually configure your trunk and your encapsulation between both switches.